Welcome to PM in the PM. This is my weekly Monday afternoon podcast where I take a recent event or a news item and we look at how it links to the ACCA performance management syllabus areas. The benefit of listening is by hearing about these real-world applications of what you're learning. It means you're more likely to remember, you'll give better answers to application questions, and as I always say, this won't only help with performance management, it will help if you're studying advanced performance management as well. So I recently saw in the news that Guinness, which is a division of Diageo is a multinational beverage company, and Guinness is very well known for its stout. It began production in 1759 in Dublin in Ireland and has undoubtedly been the most successful producer of stout worldwide. Now in the late 90s when I was a student, Guinness was actually my main drink when going out. I still drink it now, but as I'm a few years more senior, I just don't go out as much. Guinness doesn't work as well at home because it needs nitrogen to get the right head, although I know that Guinness have invested in technology and you can actually get a pretty decent Guinness at home now, but it's still much better in a pub. But what's happened with Guinness? Guinness appears to have got to a point where demand has exceeded supply, and it seems like it's happened very suddenly and quite drastically. Now there are two problems in business, in any business. Either you're too busy or you're too quiet, and both are problematic, but different sets of problems, and it seems like Guinness is now too busy. It's become a victim of its own success, and a big driver appears to be social media. There's a viral TikTok called Split the G, and the aim is you get a pint of Guinness, and the first drink you have out of it, when you put the glass back down, the aim is to get the top of the drink split in the letter G on the glass in half. There's been some celebrities doing this, and it appears that it's caught on, and it appears that maybe that's caused a rapid increase in demand. The people at Guinness will be very aware that they have a bottleneck that they need to deal with. And from what I can understand, it looks like before this happened, demand was the bottleneck, i.e. the limit to what they could sell was about what people were willing to buy. But now it appears that it's some part of their production process cannot meet that demand. In performance management, we use the term bottleneck and bottleneck resource. It's interchangeable with the term binding constraint, and it's any part of a production process that limits production overall. It's the lowest capacity part of the process. It's inevitable that any production line will have a bottleneck. Sometimes it's sales, like I just said it probably was with Guinness before. Quite often it's a production step, and in the performance management exam it's very likely to be a production stage, either due to availability of a particular material or availability of labour hours or machine hours. It's quite a common scenario in the PM exam where you have a bottleneck resource or a binding constraint. It comes up in two main syllabus areas. It comes up in the theory of constraints, which is part of Throughput accounting, and that's in syllabus area B. It also comes up in limiting factors, which is part of syllabus C. Now, Throughput accounting, that's a management accounting technique, one of the management accounting techniques that you need to understand and learn for the PM exam, which is based on the theory of constraints. So what is the theory of constraints? Simply put, it's about how quickly an organization can turn materials into sales, how quickly it can take raw materials and sell them and get money. But they need to be doing that whilst keeping conversion and investment costs to a minimum. And when we're talking about the theory of constraints and throughput accounting, we use this term throughput contribution. And this is really important because it's easy to get confused with more traditional costing compared to throughput accounting. With throughput accounting, when we're talking about the throughput contribution, the only variable cost is materials. I'll repeat that, it's so important. The only variable cost is materials. Everything else is considered what's called a factory cost or a conversion cost. And again, those two terms, factory cost, conversion cost, they're used interchangeably. And that's obviously very different to marginal costing. For example, in marginal costing, labour is considered a variable cost. And it's an easy mistake to make. And you can almost guarantee with one of the multiple choice questions, one of the distractors would be if you accidentally included labour as a variable cost. So just to reinforce, throughput contribution equals sales revenue minus direct material costs. Nothing else goes in there. So the theory of constraints, one of the key people who was involved in coming up with this theory was a person called Goldratt. You won't be asked a name in the exam, but Goldratt identified 5 steps to dealing with a constraint or a bottleneck. and you could easily be asked questions on these. The 5 steps are: step 1, identify the bottleneck or binding constraint. If you don't know where the limit is in your production, you won't know where to focus your efforts. Step 2 is you exploit that bottleneck. Now what that means is make it as good as it can be, i.e. get the highest possible output from that bottleneck. Make sure it is at full capacity. This may mean that you allow a small amount of buffer inventory just before the bottleneck stage, so that it can always be at capacity. And then step 3 is subordinate all prior steps to work at the same pace as the bottleneck. And what do we mean by that? If your bottleneck can only produce 1,000 units per day, there's no point the step before having 2,000 units go through it, because all you're going to do is build up work in progress. And in the theory of constraints, that's a big no-no. If you're limited at your bottleneck as 1,000 units, then every step before is also limited to 1,000 units. Every step after will also be limited to 1,000 because that's all that will go through. And just to reinforce, we don't want to build up lots of work in progress. We don't want to build up lots of inventory just before the bottleneck. I did say we're allowed a bit of buffer inventory, and that's so that step 2 is always at capacity. But in general, we avoid work in progress when we're dealing with the theory of constraints. Step 4 is we elevate the bottleneck. What that means is we dedicate resource to increase that bottleneck. That might be more labor, that might be buying more machines, maybe trying to look for better efficiencies, longer hours, more days per week, making sure things like routine maintenance are done outside of production time. Anything you can do to elevate the number of products or number of units that can go through that bottleneck. That's step 4. And what will then happen is that current bottleneck will no longer be a bottleneck. Something else will become a bottleneck. And that's where step 5 comes in. You return to step 1, you identify the new bottleneck, and you repeat the process. Now at some point as you keep doing this, the bottleneck will end up being about how many units you can sell. And that's still a bottleneck. And then you would go on some sort of promotion to try and increase demand. And that's the way the theory of constraints helps focus all the resources where they're going to give the most benefit. Now there's some unusual things that we have to accept in the theory of constraints. I've already talked about one in terms of inventory. Another one is we accept idle capacity at other stages. If you've done your MA exam, traditional cost accounting, you'll remember that one of the things there is to drive idle time down, not to have people or machines sitting around doing nothing. In theory of constraints and throughput accounting, we accept idle capacity at other stages in the process. That's a really important distinction. You could easily be given a question on that in the exam. And the reason is, in the theory of constraints, it's considered wasteful. It's not doing anything except increasing inventory. That's another thing that's really different in the theory of constraints. We don't want to produce inventory. We don't want work in progress, which also counters this traditional cost accounting principles. The benefit of not having inventory is it saves money. Inventory takes up space. We have to tie up working capital, so there's finance costs associated with that. There's opportunity costs, risk of theft, risk of damage, risk of obsolescence. So in the theory of constraints, we accept idle time at other stages and we do not build up inventory. With that small caveat that I mentioned earlier, that we accept some buffer inventory just before the bottleneck, so we never run the risk of our bottleneck not being used till its full capacity. In the exam, there's lots of capacity for being asked calculations in throughput accounting. I won't be doing any of those on a podcast, but there's some common pitfalls to remember. One I already mentioned at the beginning, the throughput contribution equals the cost of sales minus the cost of direct materials. Do not include anything else. Everything else is a conversion cost. Another key area where you can make mistakes is in units. Sometimes you'll get information in minutes, sometimes in hours. Make sure you're consistent. It doesn't matter which unit you use normally, as long as you're always using the same one in the question. And the other one on a similar vein is when you're calculating the cost per factory hour, also known as the conversion cost per factory hour, make sure you do it for the same period. So for example, if you're working out the total factory costs per year, make sure you use a year's worth of bottleneck resource when doing that calculation. If you're working out the total factory costs per month, make sure you're using a month's worth of bottleneck resource. Again, an easy mistake to make. Often you have to prorate a month up to a year or a year down to a month in order to do that calculation. And the other thing that the examiner often does is they present the information more like a traditional cost accounting table with labour costs, direct material costs. And what you need to make sure you do is take those labour costs and add them onto the conversion costs to do your throughput accounting calculations. Hopefully when you look at an example, that will all become really clear what that means. And another part of the theory of constraints is how can a company improve? Two of the main ways is they can increase their throughput per bottleneck resource, or they can decrease their operating cost per bottleneck resource. I'll say those again. They can either increase their throughput per bottleneck resource. That means if they were limited to 1,000 units per day, if they can push it to 1,050 with that same resource, that same machine, if that was the limit, then that will improve their performance. Or if they can decrease their operating costs, so that would be if they can reduce their fixed overheads or their labour costs and still get the same throughput, then again, that improves their performance. So the other area this does come up, as I said earlier, is in syllabus C and limiting factors. And the way this will likely come up is you'll have multiple products and you will have a factor that is limited, often a material or machine hours. Again, very similar to what we've just said. And the key here is identifying which of the products has the highest throughput contribution per unit of bottleneck resource. So for examples, if materials is our limiting factor, we can only get so much of a particular material, and we use that material to make product A and product B. What we need to calculate is for every kilogram of material that product A uses, how much do we get? Let's say it's $20 or £20. And then for material B, for every kilogram we use, how much do we get? If it's $30 or £30, then our priority is going to be to produce B first, up to the point where we can't sell any more B, and only then will we start producing A. And that's how limiting factors uses this throughput accounting process. And there's been many questions where the students have been asked how many units of a particular product is produced, and often you have to go through that process, work out the throughput contribution per unit of bottleneck resource, rank the products in order, put as much resource into the highest ranking one, and if there's spare capacity, then do the second one, and if there's spare capacity, then do the third one. At some point you run out of capacity, for example materials in this case, and you work out the maximum number of products you can make based on that prioritization. So today we've used Guinness and the fact that they're in the news and probably have a new bottleneck that's developed very suddenly to help us talk about the theory of constraints and throughput accounting and limiting factors, all parts of the performance management syllabus. Thanks very much for tuning in to PM in the PM. I hope you found this episode informative. I'd love to receive feedback in the comments, and as always, please do share with any friends or colleagues who you think would benefit. Until next time, this is Richard Guyver signing off.